you for coming today to assist us with this inquiry. This is our first session of the inquiry, which will last for the next few months, on the issue about use of forensic science in criminal justice system and in other areas. And with your background, we particularly, of course, are interested from the science aspect of it, but of course we will also have some questions for you from other areas. Before we start, if you wish to introduce yourself for the record from my left and say who you are, who you represent, if you do represent anybody. If you want to say a brief word, please do so. Otherwise, we'll then move on to questions. Please, Professor Thompson. Is it?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to come down this afternoon. My name is Tim Thompson. I'm a Professor in Applied Biological Anthropology and Associate Dean for Learning and Teaching at Teesside University. My background is in forensic anthropology, which I have practiced in and done a considerable amount of research and teaching in that area as well. I am a fellow of the professional body, the Chartered Society of Forensic Sciences, and also the Royal Anthropological Institute as well.
But you have a background from another good university.
Sorry? Yes, yeah, that's right.
Thank you. My name is Carl Harrison. I'm the director of a specialist forensic services provision company dealing mainly with forensic ecology. I work primarily as a forensic archaeologist. I'm a visiting professor at the University of West London.
I'm Dr. Sarah Morris. I am the head of the Digital Forensics Unit at Cranfield University. I also run the MSc in Digital Forensics. My background is computer science and artificial intelligence, and I specialise in document forensics.
Thank you very much. Do any of you want to make any opening statement? Or are you happy to go on to the questions? Okay, go on to the question. Well, if I might kick off, and mine is related to trying to hear you tell us about what you think are the current strengths and weaknesses of the forensic science that would be used to support in the criminal justice system, and how you might improve that. Who would like to start?
I'm happy to start.
Okay.
I think if I kind of talk from an academic university perspective, which is where I have the most experience, I think we have some excellent education facilities. We have excellent courses. We're training very good graduates in the forensic sciences in a range of disciplines coming through. We're engaged in some high-quality research at the universities and institutions which are contributing towards the forensic science. We have some good collaborations between our university institutions and private forensic providers and various police forces, and there is a commitment from a number of universities that work in this field to support the criminal justice system. I would say that it's a bit patchy and fragmented in its approach, though.
Okay. Dr. Harrison, have you?
To add to Tim's comments, if I can approach that question from the perspective of practice, one of the key strengths I think that the UK has is the breadth of practice in terms of the range of different scientific disciplines that have applied themselves to forensics. The challenge, I think, is how to maintain that breadth in the current system.
Dr. Morris?
I guess the only thing I'd like to add is that for digital forensics in particular, it's an incredibly fast-moving area with a lot of new technology appearing all the time. So for us, trying to keep up with the latest scientific techniques or how to work with devices makes it a very research-led field, and that can be very difficult for us. But the people on the ground are very committed to doing that, so I'd say that's a real strength.
How strong are our academic institutions in all of the areas of forensic science? How would they compare with other countries?
I think I think it's probably fair to say that different institutions have different strengths in terms of their areas of expertise. In terms of the delivery of higher education courses, we do have the QAA Forensic Science benchmark that we adhere to, and our professional body, the Chartered Society of Forensic Sciences, has an accreditation scheme as well, whereby courses are signed off or not, depending upon the quality of the provision that they provide. I think it's probably fair to say that much of the forensic university provision is in the what was, I guess, the post-92s, the new universities. There's a little bit in some of the more traditional Russell Group universities, but it's largely focused on the more vocational institutions. However, on the whole, the quality that they deliver in terms of the graduates that our universities are producing are of a high quality and comparable to other countries.
Okay. Lord Fox.
Dr. Harrison, you alluded to a challenging environment. So, what is the challenge? What is this environmental challenge to the profession?
The challenge comes when I think it's implicit in your question that it's seen as a profession, that there is some consistent whole across forensic science. Many of the specialisms that we deal within might be absolutely pivotal to an exceedingly important criminal case, but might not be used very often by police forces. And as a consequence, some of the broad brush contractual arrangements put in place by forces with core forensic service providers frequently don't include that breadth. So where forces go to seek those solutions, whether it's into the university sector to seek an academic who can also practice in a specialist area, or whether it's to a specialist company, maintaining that breadth and that richness of a forensic ecosystem, I think, is one of the key challenges we'll face in the next 5 years.
To be clear, what you're saying is that the interactivity between the police and others tends to be on a point basis rather than a breadth of different points. Is that what you're saying?
And that for the most part, the contracts that form the key frameworks and the relationships between police forces as commissioners of forensic work and the large forensic service providers as the completers of that work relate to a narrow but very deep stream of core forensic work, rather than to these beats
rather than
around
taking
the outside.
advantage of the breadth that might be available.
Baroness Young and then Baroness Morgan.
Could I ask Professor Thompson, do all of the students who graduate in forensics get jobs? I mean, how's the supply and demand?
Well, there's a high when you look at the figures for employability after forensic science degrees. There is high employability. It's not necessarily in the fields of forensic science. What most good forensic science or forensic biology, those sorts of degrees, are offering is a good science degree with some applied content as well. So students will go off and work in graduate level jobs, but it might not necessarily be in the field.
And is that a problem? Is that an issue?
I think there are enough high quality graduates for the jobs on offer. I think if there are more jobs on offer, then I think we would certainly have the quality graduates to fill that. Yes.
Baroness Morgan.
Can I just go back to something Dr. Harrison was saying? I guess this will come up in our next session as well. Has the relationship with commissioning changed? I mean, was the situation better in the past, or is it a sort of status quo?
I think that I'm of an age where I run the risk of being a grumpy old man about that relationship in the past. I think the challenges have changed. I don't think it was ever perfect, and I think that the contractual system that is currently in place is essential to maintain business as usual, but it's important to be mindful of the risk that there needs to be a means by which that breadth of specialism can be preserved within the system as well.
So was the breadth there in a different period, or has it always been a problem?
The breadth, I think it's always been a challenge. The breadth was there in the past. and it remains how that breadth continues to find a way to function as our quality benchmarks become more overt and they increase. So your university practitioner of a specialist subject who perhaps might work for a police force once or twice a year, if they're suddenly required to, if their organisation, the university is suddenly required to invest in production of standing operating procedures that would lead them towards an ISO qualification, that will freeze a lot of people out, potentially a lot of specialists out from the market.
Thank you. All of us forgot to do something that we should be doing, including me,
declaring
which
interest,
is I should be declaring my interest. Apart from being a professor emeritus of the University of Dundee, I have no other interest to declare. Lord Griffiths.
No interest as well. Can I just come back to your answer regarding the breadth and so on? Presumably, if I'm a police officer concerned with trying to solve a particular crime, that would be my priority. To expand the whole service would require a budgetary increase, I assume, to do it. Or is that not so?
No. Yes, rather than expand this framework contract so it takes up every possible conceivable forensic discipline, what is required is a means by which it's possible to be flexible around the edges of it. That if you did suddenly need a forensic tattoo analyst or a forensic ornithologist, that you have that ability to reach out to somebody to provide that answer for you.
Right.
Okay. Lord Caker.
Well, Chairman, thank you. I should declare my interest as Professor at University College London and Chairman of the Judicial Appointments Commission. I just want to explore the robustness of the evidence base that attends the use of forensic techniques in investigation and prosecution of crimes. Really the question is, can we be satisfied as citizens that that evidence base genuinely exists? And if not, where are the gaps and how are those gaps being addressed?
I'm afraid to some extent that question is quite general, and you'll probably get three rather specific answers from us from our own forensic specialisms. As an archaeologist, I tend to carry my science around in a bucket, so I'm not performing trace evidence comparisons. I'm not therefore relying upon large-scale databases of a library of potential trace materials. I'm relying upon long-standing principles of excavation in order to provide an interpretation. So that sounds like a rather cowardly answer from my perspective, but I tend not to suffer so much as some of my colleagues from the evidence-based answer.
But there is validity to the approach that you take.
There is, yes.
And in other areas of forensic science?
Professor Thompson.
Yes, there is, and I think it's as Carl says, it's about that experience that you've gained, but also, I think also there's an important role that some of our academic journals play as well. So as a researchers in the university, obviously we're producing our research and publishing that in peer-reviewed journals, and so that is a mechanism by which we can provide that evidence base for other practitioners.
But in the initial answer to my question, you alluded to the fact that academics do work with both the private testing laboratories, but also with police and judiciary, presumably. The question Lord Caker is asking is, would you like to repeat it, Lord Caker, the citizens?
Yeah, I think the question would be this. One hears, let us say, outside forensic science, of moments in time where a scientific theory or a particular piece of published work is refuted. How does your particular scientific discipline deal with that in terms of the important consequences forensic science has in the prosecution of crime? I mean, has it happened? Are there forensic techniques that once were considered absolutely robust, which subsequent academic endeavour and research has identified not to be so robust?
I think in my discipline, in terms of forensic anthropology, I think that there has been. I think there have been few and far between, and what we tend to see is this incremental refinement of existing methods, and hopefully that will provide the confidence. In terms of the methods that have been discarded in my area, those again they tend to be. It's quite an old discipline that I'm working in. It's fairly traditional, so those tend to be relatively older methods which are replaced by newer methods. Those newer methods are based on more appropriate sample sizing and scientific methodology. So again, we can have more confidence in that. And then in terms of our practitioners, what we tend to see is then education and publication to demonstrate that the older method needs to be replaced with a more modern method through, for example, validation studies.
And the academic community is sufficiently robust to be able to act collectively in that fashion and transmit and transfer that development of knowledge to these non-academic participants in forensic science?
I think there's two parts to that question. I think for the first part, I think we are. I think that's the basis of the scientific research that we do. I think that our ability as academics to then disseminate that information to non-academics might be perhaps not quite as strong as talking to ourselves as academics. Yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Morris, considering digital crime is on the rise apparently, do you have a comment about that question?
I'd say for us it's about the interpretation of the artifacts. So in computing, a lot of things, there is a standard definition for their purpose, but not how they're implemented. So that can lead to great variations in the kind of artifacts that you're finding and also what they mean in terms of evidence.
I'm sorry, I don't understand that.
So, for example, things like every cycle bin on a computer, there is a standard definition. It's where a user deletes files, but how it works underneath can vary depending on whether you're looking at a Mac operating system or a Windows. So it's that understanding of an evidence base where the definition is standard, but we've got underneath very different meanings. So it could result with very different user activity. So there isn't a great understanding of the difference between their function and what the artifacts underneath represent.
So should that fill us with confidence?
I think... Sorry.
Whether I should be excited or pleased or upset by that answer.
I think it leads very much to a research-based discipline. So a lot of the training that you see is around the research and understanding of the context of the artifacts. And what you'll find in digital forensics is that we've got very strong links between the academics and the practitioner community. So the universities involved with this are very active in working with the practitioners. There is a first forensic forum where practitioners and academics get together and discuss results. And I think that research base makes a difference, but still there are pockets where they're working off the function, not the underneath.
This is kind of leaping ahead, and I should say that I have no relevant interest for this. Two questions. One is, it seems to me, in light of that answer, from what I can make of it, is that it rather, what question you ask is rather more important than what answer you get. And therefore, does the user community have sufficient expertise to ask the right question of the digital forensic person? And the second point is that with the advance of digital technology, the ability to fraudulently create digital evidence is moving very quickly. And does your part of this industry have the evidence base to manage that the fraudulent creation of digital evidence?
I'd say there's definitely a misapprehension about digital forensics when people are asking us to find information. So that channel of communication, often there's a lot of work to try and work out what both sides are interested in, and that can lead to a lot of requests that are impossible and take a lot of time to try and find a workable solution. In terms of evidence base and people trying to manipulate artifacts or obscure their data, I'd say that now digital forensics has started looking more at context. So not just there is a file with a potentially indecent imaging, but actually can we tell if the user downloaded it? Can we tell where they may have got it from? So that context makes it very difficult to start obscuring or manipulating the data, because that chain, you can see if there are breaks or anomalies.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. What we're trying to explore from you as academics is, in simple terms, do you feel confident that the evidence that is used in both investigation and in judiciary of any crimes that might have committed, has the evidence given is scientifically based and the veracity of that science? Or is it the academic community is quite detached from what goes on in everyday life?
I would say in my discipline, I think there is that confidence there. I think we can be confident in the evidence base that we are presenting, and have confidence in the manner in which the academics are engaging with that research. I think, again, within my discipline, I wouldn't say that our academics are separated from what's going on in the real world. However, I think we do need to be better at communicating with the end users of the research that we're doing.
Lord Fox and then Lord Hunt.
Following up on that, and following up on the answer that you gave to Lord Kakar, in terms of the body of evidence and the confidence we can have, it would strike me that the danger is around the edges of this, where you stretch to the limits and the limitations of a particular technique. So are you confident that from your side, in a sense, from the science side, people actually understand the limitations of what they're doing, and from the user side, that from the police or the defence side, that they understand the limitations of these techniques? Because it would seem to me that is the point at which the courts could be misled, that that's where the area starts to become grey.
I would say that as a discipline we do know the boundaries of our research and our evidence, but I would also say, and it relates back to the question you asked earlier about whether or not we know the right questions to ask. And I don't think that's necessarily true for the end users of the research that we're doing, because unless you fully understand the discipline, you don't know what questions to ask. So I think there might be an issue there. And again, as the theme that I keep coming back to is that sense of communications that we need to work on between ourselves as academics and the end users.
Lord Kakar.
Lord Chairman, how large would the evidence base need to be for a particular forensic scientific technique for it to be considered acceptable? Could it just be one paper from one group describing a technique which has yet to be validated by others that would be considered appropriate to apply in the criminal justice system as evidence for prosecution of a crime? Or would there need to be more? I mean, who decides that?
In my experience, there would need to be more. That a single research paper, partly because there isn't necessarily that direct mainline link between groups of research authors and forensic practitioners taking that evidence forwards. But in my experience, there would be greater validity, greater probing of a technique before it came to court.
I would absolutely agree with that. One of my roles that I've done over the past few years is I've been editor-in-chief and associate editor for a number of forensic academic journals, and certainly one of the things that I've seen through that particular role are lots of preliminary studies, early studies of new methods or applying existing methods in new areas. And I certainly think I would agree that one study alone is not enough, and again, as academics, we need to work more on building up the number of studies that we have to show the validity of research.
And it's Morgan, sorry, you want to come back.
Sorry, I'm so sorry, Lord. Just if one were an expert witness in a medical negligence case, there are very clear guidelines on what a medical expert witness would have to do, the approach they would have to take to the evidence base available, and their obligations in terms of sharing all sides of a particular argument as part of a proper evaluation of that evidence. Does the same exist when an expert academic is obliged to give forensic scientific evidence?
It's not as clearly laid out as it is within medicine.
Okay. Yeah. Baroness Morgan, then Lord Hunt, who might take the other question also.
I was going to take on my question, which sort of follows anyway, which was really on your communication point. I mean, can you? I mean, what is your assessment of the level of understanding there is in the criminal justice system about the boundaries of forensic science? And you know, if you've got to be able to communicate with judges, with lawyers, with juries, what's the rules of the game really? What are the rules of engagement? How do you have a? I mean, how do you approach it? And how do you stop one side, one part of this system, plucking what it wants out of the evidence, the what you're bringing forward, and playing with it in essence?
I think that's an important question. I think that we are. My feeling is that we're at the stage now of working through some of that in terms of how to make that work, how to have those honest conversations about boundaries, what you can and cannot and should not use in terms of providing evidence. I think my experience is that people's understanding varies from discipline to discipline, and again it comes back to a bit of a point that we made earlier about there are some disciplines that are used more routinely than others, and there's a greater understanding of those disciplines than there are on the other disciplines on the periphery of practice, I think.
I think if it assists...
Hang on, he's coming back.
Julian Hunt.
Sorry, I should have said I'm Vice Chair of King's College Council. Sorry.
I'm a Fellow of the Royal Society and an academic. So, start at the beginning, on our previous discussion, I mean, how can science be used most effectively? And I experienced an interesting case at the Old Bailey when I was a technical expert witness, and what I did, and I've noticed others do, people will do ad hoc experiments for a particular case, which I think what Dr. Harrison was saying he did with his bucket, but the Americans have, as far as I understand, a very different approach. And unless you published, or other people have published quite a number of papers, they wouldn't allow an ingenious experiment in a bucket, as it were, to determine the case. Whereas in Britain, I would think, my impression is that it might be one, it might be the other, and there will be sort of judgment taking place as to whether. So the case I particularly was involved with, I did all these experiments. My only point, really, which I think is a question, is that the prosecution did experiments which were very expensive, paid for by the taxpayer, and were completely wrong. And the defence had some very cheap experiments done in my kitchen and lab, and they were right, and they were the ones that won the day. Anyway, but the point.
Thank goodness for that.
Quite so. The man is anyway. So you sounded, if I may say so, quite definitive that it must be in the academic approach, whereas it seems to me that judges and lawyers and so on actually take quite an empirical view in Britain, and they look at the judgment. Perhaps you'd like to comment.
I think from my perspective, I do think the research should come through that publication process. I'm not going to say that process is perfect, but what it does provide is peer review, and it provides the opportunity to critique data and experiments that come forward, and because the data, especially with the move these days in terms of open access and presenting data as part of your publication, it allows other people the opportunity to challenge and test your ideas as well.
Can I just ask supplementary back to my question, which was, you raised the question, you said that the boundaries, there's a conversation, there's a sort of discussion starting about what the boundaries should be. Where's that conversation happening? Who's running that conversation? Who's where's it located? Who's involved in it?
I think that's from my opinion, that's part of the problem. Is there's perhaps a lack of consistency across. That there are conversations happening between practitioners and perhaps the police that they're working directly with on an individual basis, but also on an institutional basis. There are conversations that might happen through that are facilitated through the professional bodies, for example, as well. There are conversations that are happening as part of CPD training, and so there's lots of little things happening. But I think
it's not like the MOJ is saying this is.
Yeah.
No, okay. Thank you.
Finished, or you?
Yeah, that's what I wanted to say, actually, if I may add, is that the use of background scientific knowledge is something, of course, I as scientists agree with. But the question of the application in a particular case, there may not have been any previous study on that. But the background is very, very important. But the impression I had was that in the United States there's a very dogmatic approach. Unless there's been a very careful experiment on that very detailed case, they wouldn't use that information. My point is that there's background science, which is very important. But there may well not have been, as it were, any previous very detailed study. And I just wonder how you know, in teaching the subject as an academic, how do you address this sort of dichotomy?
It's challenging indeed. I think what we would focus on is the teaching of specific methods and the strengths and weaknesses of various methods that you might use, and then. But you're right. There's only so many different contexts in which you can demonstrate a specific method. But I think if we have a strong enough understanding of those underlying methods, and perhaps that's what I mean in terms of the publications. You know, you're publishing and demonstrating validity in certain methods, and then I guess it would be up to the individual academic when it's applied to a unique circumstances where it's never been applied to before.
Does this also apply to numerical computational methods? I think it probably does.
I would say it is a very challenging area of digital forensics because having a paper, the chances are the paper is going to be out of date in terms of there will have been a software update or you'll be looking at a slightly different device. So for us, when we're doing the teaching, it has to be very research-led teaching, that this is how we established a method on this particular piece of software on this version, but here's the technique you could use to follow through on newer versions.
See, what we try to explore, and let me try and simplify it because it's important to get this from you, is how accurate is the evidence in scientific terms presented to those that investigate the crime and those that then are judiciary who use the science to determine the veracity of that investigation. And what is the link? For instance, Lord Kekar gave an example. If you take medicine, you get academics who do the research. Based on that research, once the robustness of this research is demonstrated, is used by the practitioners to deliver care. If they fail to deliver that care in a proper way, then they might be tried in the courts, and the evidence used by the courts is the science and their practice. So does that happen in the forensic science and the criminal justice system? Or is there gaps that we do need to fill?
I think it's an area that is being challenged by the current system. Previously, we had a role in major criminal investigations called the Byford scientist, who would have been a Byford scientist. Yes. Their role would have been, they would have been an experienced scientist in their own specialist area, forensic scientist, but they would have had a breadth of experience, and effectively they would be seconded to work with a police investigation team to provide exactly that level of pathfinder advice to assist in facilitating the investigators' access to a range of different forensic capabilities and in communicating to them where the science was currently at and what the strengths and weaknesses were with that science. Now, one of the challenges that we face currently under the present contracted position of science is that different analytical techniques are effectively coded and priced by forensic providers. So in effect, police forces are choosing from a menu rather than receiving that sort of level of active advice.
Right. We're getting somewhere. Thank you very much for that.
That stopped with the demise of the FSS.
Dr. Morris, you wanted to comment?
I was just going to say that on a similar line, the expensive price of software is meaning that not everybody has access to the full range of tools they need to do a thorough job.
Whereas Morgan, I think you dealt with your questions. So can I go back to Lord Hunt again? Oh, sorry, Lord Fox.
Just follow up. Sorry, just on this ad hocery, which was introduced rightly by Lord Hunt, he presented the contrasting US and UK court approach to, if you like, ad hoc delivery of scientific evidence versus something that needs to be more established in the US. What I didn't hear from you is whether you thought that was a good idea in the long run or not a good idea, and whether the US system of having more robust background to any particular piece of evidence rather than an individual scientist trading off their reputation to say, here is a piece of evidence. Because after all, Einstein got things wrong. He could have stood in court and had a fabulous reputation, but he might have been wrong. So where we are at the moment is that we present a scientist who can then present an ad hoc piece of evidence. Do you think that is a good thing for British courts?
I think it's a vital thing for British court to retain that flexibility in the system, where if we simply do not have an answer that has appeared within a peer-reviewed publication, that we should somehow abandon a scientific approach to investigating it. However, I think coming back to Tim's comment about open access journals and access to data, it then becomes even more important that the data behind those ad hoc experiments is robustly dealt with within the court.
Exactly.
Lord Hunt, can I move on to your question?
So my question is, how should further research funding for forensic science be justified, and what should the focus of such research? And one of the points being is there's often more money on one side than the other side, and what I couldn't understand in the case I was involved with, why you couldn't have a discussion about the experiments that were being conducted. You had two different sets of experiments. Yes. Whereas the judge, it seems to me, and the jury should have had a discussion about how the experiment was set up, how they analysed the data, what was the data produced. Instead of which, you had completely different experiments and experimental techniques being offered to the two different parties. And what do you think about that? I mean, is that right?
I agree entirely, and I think without wanting to confound or conflate two of your questions, I've been commissioned by the police, by prosecuting authorities, something like 160 times in my career, and I've been commissioned by Defence Counsel 3 times, which reflects the level of funding that's available to challenge specialist forensic evidence. And I think tying in with that if you can bring together scientific representatives from both the prosecution and defence to agree the tenets of an experiment prior to it taking place, that sounds like an eminently sensible thing to do.
Well, we had a question in the Parliament here, which I put down, and the then Attorney General didn't think it was a good idea at all. But anyway.
That doesn't make it wrong.
Lord Mayor, you have 2 questions.
Well, can I ask about the sort of level of understanding of forensic science? I'm sorry, I should declare an interest. I'm a fellow of the Royal Society and an academic at Cambridge University. The sort of level of understanding between or within the criminal justice system, in other words, that you as forensic scientists have to get the message across to lawyers. And an example lying behind my question is the whole area of, in electronics we talk about signal to noise ratio. So increasingly the science in forensic science is becoming more and more expert at using very minute traces, for example for DNA or for other forms of testing. At what point is it explained to the lawyers that there is a point at which the level of testing is so minute that it might not be significant. I mean, how do you get that sort of message across?
I think that's one of our challenges at the moment. I think that you're right. I think that our development of our methods generally within the forensic sciences are allowing us to look at smaller and smaller samples. I think the methods that we have available to us are becoming more and more complex and require an increased level of understanding of the underlying science as well. So I think it's becoming increasingly challenging to communicate that side of things to non-experts. I think that it's easy to say, but the solution, certainly in terms of my experience, is about opening dialogue and having those conversations. Again, we came back to the question earlier about understanding the right questions to ask, and I think unless there's a certain level of understanding of a discipline before you start, even before you start talking about the individual methods that one might be using, it's difficult to really appreciate or contextualise what the expert might want to say. I'm not sure of the correct avenue for those sorts of conversations. I suspect we might have to use multiple channels to make that work. But again, just talking from my experience, one of the things that we have done very successfully in terms of getting across the nuance of anthropology is in terms of very short bite-sized training, hands-on training and demonstrations in terms of kind of active learning for people who might want to engage with the discipline so that they understand where to start in terms of asking those challenging questions.
I think from my perspective, I'm very fortunate to practice a discipline that most juries will have some intuitive understanding of. So I can talk to people about the soils that are local to where they are, and I can talk to them about if you dig a hole in the ground and fill it in, that the texture of that changes. So they can develop a rudimentary understanding of what I do relatively quickly in a court environment. And that then assists me in then communicating some of the more arcane aspects, I suppose, of the excavation process. That comes at a cost, in that there's a challenge to that, in that what I do doesn't appear very scientific to police forces. Therefore, the risk is that people will conduct excavations themselves without that background. And my discipline can't be retested. So often when we talk about forensic sciences and we talk about forensic biology, then the cold case review and the return to exhibits, the opportunity to retest, that can't exist, because I'm going to destroy that graveside by excavating and recovering the victim of that crime. So the onus on my level of recording and the importance of challenge of what I do by the defence is, if anything, even greater, that has probity within a court environment.
Lord Fox.
2 points. First of all, you talked about dialogue and the need for open channels. What are the professional associations doing here? I mean, what are they for? How professional are they? What kind of barriers are there to being members of them? How do they operate? What Lord Kaka used the analogy of the medical profession, where we understand the professional bodies and how they stand and what they're for. I don't get any sense of what you're, and because you're crossing so many different scientific disciplines, it would seem to me that it's a rather more disparate and less unified voice. So how do you pull that together? What are the opportunities?
I think you're right. I think there is an element of fragmentation, especially as you start moving towards, again, some of these disciplines on the periphery, where you might have a subject-based professional body which you engage with actively, and the qualifying criteria for being members varies from professional body to professional body. But then you also might want to engage with the professional body for the forensic science, and we have the Chartered Society of Forensic Sciences, which acts in that role. And again, membership for that varies. There are different levels of membership, and the professional bodies working at the moment on developing a chartered forensic practitioner status as well to address some of these issues. They do work as, I don't want to say a mediator, but they work as a body for bringing different interest groups together in terms of the scientists and the lawyers and other elements of the criminal justice system. But I think part of the challenge is that it's such a broad beast. There are so many disciplines and there are so many interests.
If I happen to be a scientist in a particular area and you happen to be organising the defence of someone, I wouldn't need to be a member of any of those associations in order to be used in court to give evidence, for example. So is that right? So there's no prerequisite for anybody to be part of these bodies, signed up to whatever charter they have or anything like that?
I think that's correct.
Yes, it's become a more complicated question to answer in the last few years.
It has. So what we're...
Sorry, why?
Well, what we've seen over the past few years is a recognition of that very issue. And the professional bodies have started to develop frameworks to use for accrediting practitioners in the different disciplines, and again, different professional bodies have different mechanisms by which they do that, so there's no consistency across the different disciplines. But so I think the aim would be going forward that again within the courts you would look for that accreditation. Has this particular individual been accredited? Have they been signed off as being competent within their discipline? Have they signed up to the use of the standards within their discipline? But there's no requirement yet to be accredited.
From a practice perspective, Lord Fox, I see a range. If police forces phone the company to request a forensic archaeologist, some will say, are you accredited? And that will be one of the very first points of conversation before we start to talk about the case. Some won't ask. Some won't call the company and will actively avoid using an accredited expert in order to save money. So currently it's a patchwork that we work with.
Thank you.
Lord Mayor.
Could I ask about research funding? I mean, obviously it's very important for you at universities. Can you say a little bit about where do you get your research funding from? And is there an issue that because your subject crosses many different disciplines, that it's not so easy because it's not a question of going to one research council? And can UKRI play a role in this, in its new coordinating role?
Yes, I think it can. I think you're absolutely right. I think the part of the challenge that forensic science has had is that it is very multidisciplinary. It can be very multidisciplinary in terms of its approach. It has historically struggled in gaining funding that might be available through some of the funding councils, not necessarily through a specific forensic stream, but because it's allied to other disciplines. So there's struggled historically because, as we said earlier, that a lot of the forensic courses and research is going on in some of the less prestigious universities that have historically struggled to get funding there. There's been some success more recently through bodies like the Leverhulme Trust who have funded work in there. But I think that one of the challenges is, and again it comes back to a theme that we've spoken about already this afternoon, is that there's one of the ways of attracting research funding is by presenting a research project that's very exciting, might be quite blue skies, it might be very innovative, and that's entirely appropriate. But there's also a need to be able to fund perhaps more mundane but very important studies in terms of validation and so on, which tends not to get the funding because it lacks those sorts of doesn't lack the quality of the research, but it perhaps lacks those qualities that funding councils look for in new research.
So where do you get your research funding from, typically?
Well, again, we've had luck through, again, things like the Leverhulme Trust, which specifically funds multidisciplinary work. That's been very successful. Otherwise, what we tend to find, again, in many institutions, is that, and again, this leads back to a problem that we have with the research in forensic science, is that you might end up doing lots of very small-scale projects, which are cheaper to run, perhaps develop from master's projects, develop into PhDs, but fundamentally are quite small-scale and relatively cheap to do. Doesn't mean that the science isn't valid, but what that tends to mean, again, is that you have a slightly piecemeal approach to research in the forensic sciences.
And if you know, in a perfect world, if there was an opportunity for larger sums of money being accessible to you, what would be the focus of your research? Is it possible to say that, or is it?
I think it depends from discipline to discipline. But I think what you do need is to evidence that you've had conversations with end users. There's no point in doing research in the forensic science that isn't going to benefit the criminal justice system, and you want to engage with the police and engage with the lawyers in order to make sure that the questions that you're seeking to answer are valid questions, and that the research that you do, the way that it's structured, will have the meaningful impact that you hope. One of the other things that we need to have a think to consider as well is that to ensure that forensic science research is taken seriously as a body of research, and again what we've seen now is acknowledgement within the REF framework, for example, that forensic science is occurring, and it notes that it might be cross-disciplinary, and I think that's a step in the right direction in terms of that, providing that credibility for the research that we might want to do.
Dr. Morris, apart from your unit, how many other academic units will be involved in digital forensics?
There are a few across the country. Most of them are linked with cyber security units and in traditional computer science departments. So the larger ones are Napier, University College Dublin, Liverpool John Moores and Sunderland.
Okay. But cyber security presumably is more related to the financial industry, is it?
Cybersecurity tends to be the protection of devices and looking at how to secure them, whereas digital forensics would be after the fact, looking at what occurred. So the two go very well together.
Okay. Lord Hunt and Lord Fox.
So one of the features of modern society is that we are having more and more data collected up in the streets and shops and everywhere. You might have thought that if we were able to analyze this data, we would become a safer environment. But that's not obviously the case. And do you think that the amount of money that's spent on analyzing signals and data is sufficient? And we could actually be a safer society if we had the resources to use our data. But perhaps this doesn't count as forensic science. This is crime prevention, as it were. But occasionally, presumably, there's a lot of crime which is observed in these data systems, and then you can apply forensically. I just wonder whether you'd like to comment on that.
Absolutely. Well, I guess it comes down to research funding again. A lot of the work done in this area will be proof of concept using artificial intelligence techniques and more traditional computer science, which your digital forensic analyst may not have the understanding to explain the techniques they're applying. I think it would be good to get more research done in that area, particularly, more application of traditional computer science techniques to digital forensics to bring the two disciplines in line a little bit more.
But could this bring forensic science together with these sort of wider questions of a healthier, safer environment? I mean, at the moment it's quite separate, forensic science, but actually in this data-rich world, presumably, it could become a much more overall approach. Might even use the word holistic.
Lord Wellens.
I have no interest to declare. Just for information, is there not a distinction from the forensic science angle as between cybercrime, which gets you involved into sort of dark webs and hacking and this, that and the other, with a lot of network stuff in it, and other types of crime where the digital interest is more in finding and analysing data that may be on devices of one kind or another? Are they taught as one thing? They seem to me to be quite different.
So we tend to teach them together across, looking more at the information left on the device rather than the specific crime that would be investigated. So it's more about the, I guess, the end result. So you would see potentially in a murder that they've used an internet browser, say, to look up different poisons, whereas they might use the same technique for cybercrime, for hacking. So we look more at the software than the crime itself.
I can see that, but you think there is no distinction really between the nature of the forensic science as it applies to network things like the dark network, dark web rather, and so on and so forth, and the periphery of devices. Is that right?
Yeah, I guess because the range of crimes that digital forensics can be applied to is so wide that we tend to just focus on more what user activity might be rather than the specific types of crime.
Okay, thank you.
Lord Fox.
Well, I think most of that answer from Seven has come through, but I just really wanted to follow up on the very good point that Lord Hunt raised. The Turin Institute is supposedly doing quite a lot of what Lord Hunt was alluding to. Is there any sense of communication between the digital forensic world and the Turin Institute and what they're about? Because it would seem to me that there's a lot of potential in that connection.
I'm aware of links between the cybersecurity disciplines and the Turing Institute, but I'm not aware of any between the digital forensics and the Turing Institute.
But I think the other part of the question.
Thank you very much. Lord Borwick.
A question really for Dr. Morris. With the growth of digital forensic matters, the sheer volume of evidence that you'll be producing will perhaps swamp many cases. And do you find that lawyers who, my prejudice, I tend to believe is rather analogue sort of people, rather like politicians, are equipped to deal with this extra load of evidence that you can produce, or do you need? Do you think it would be better to have younger lawyers and younger jurors to cope with the? That can't be done, of course. But how do you deal with this problem of understanding of the evidence?
Well, I don't necessarily think they need to be younger, but there is this tendency to ask for a lot of information, and as I said earlier, it can be a lot of information that is either irrelevant or impossible to gather. Big data for us is a huge problem. As you'll have seen, computer hard drives are growing. The range of devices that we're asked to analyse is growing, so it can be anything from a computer to a games console to a washing machine to a car. So there's just this wealth of devices, each with different challenges, each with different types of information we can get and different meanings. So it's just about opening communication, really, and training them that what we might be able to do with a car, we may not be able to do with a washing machine.
And the well, that's fair enough. The evidence that is given, the task is to explain it to the jury. Do you get any feeling that the juries naturally understand this, or do they nod wisely and take it on trust?
I think in my experience, whilst the CSI effect of the media has been very good for showing that digital evidence exists, it also leads to CSI.
The television program.
In the television program,
So yes, whilst the media effect has done us good in that people know that digital forensics is a thing, it also means that a lot of people think they understand computer evidence and how computers work. So there's a lot of misunderstanding from the jury and a lot of what's the word? Presumptions about how it works.
And how can that be dealt with?
I think training on the part of the digital forensic analysts about how to present their evidence in a way that stops these misapprehensions and makes it clear, potentially describing what people may presume and then going on to showing what it actually is.
So is your department involved at all, or you personally involved at all in criminal justice system when it comes to crimes related to digital crimes?
Yeah, the Digital Forensics Unit is casework active and has been for its 20 years, so we get involved. At the moment, due to the ISO accreditation, we do more civil work than criminal, just because the cost of getting the accreditation was prohibitive.
Not boring.
No. So just very briefly, where does digital forensics stop and digital stuff begin? Because you've got a whole bunch of things like social media, which doesn't need a forensic person to investigate, but it's part of a wider digital thing. So do you do that, or does someone else do that? And if it's someone else does it, who does that? So who trawls through the Facebook and whatever else? Or is that part of what the digital forensic people do, even though in a sense you don't need to be forensic to get hold of it?
So online things like that would typically come under open source intelligence. It would be on a case-by-case basis whether that's within the remit of a digital forensic examiner or not.
So that would be part of the deal that you do at the beginning of the case?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, understood.
Okay, move on now to Baroness Young.
Declare an interest as Chancellor of Cranfield University. We've moved from having a state provider to a market provider for forensic services, at least in England and Wales. Was that a good thing or a bad thing?
Challenging.
It was a challenge. It was a highly disruptive thing. And I think the ramifications of that disruption are still being felt, and it still remains unclear where the good and the bad have fallen within that. I think that perhaps within core forensic disciplines, within biology and DNA work, then perhaps there's a little bit more business as usual there, in the sense that that is still the core volume of material that passes from a police force to a private forensic service provider, as it used to do to the Forensic Science Service. So perhaps there's a little bit less disruption there. Certainly around the edges, I would say that we see within niche disciplines an awful lot more disruption, an awful lot less clarity in terms of how our interactions with police forces as clients move forwards.
And we hear scare stories of the risks of a market approach in terms of providers failing, providers providing low standards. Are these scare stories, or is there a real issue of the sustainability and the quality of the market-driven providers?
I think that depends.
Present company accepted.
It depends upon the maturity of the tender structure, I believe, in that where groups of police force regions have tendered for the forensic services and gone out to the private forensic service providers to put forward bids. Where there's been a race to the bottom, I think perhaps we may have seen some vulnerability to that system. My personal opinion is that in the more recent force regions that have gone to tender, there seems to be a shift. There's a move towards more stable relationships, so that the periods of the contracts are increasing. There are greater amounts of research and development strands fitted within them, and there is a more holistic view of what that partnership should be between the forensic service provider and the commissioning police forces. But it is a very uneven picture across the country because of the autonomy that's built into the policing structure of England and Wales.
So if you were us, would you recommend that the state provider system came back in or not?
Personally, I wouldn't, because I think that there is a lot of strength and vibrancy to the system that's developing. What I would recommend is that we do need to continue to beat the sector towards the quality standards that are in the process of coming into place. What is required to be paired with that currently doesn't exist on the agenda at all is a form of commissioning authority that effectively then holds police forces to task in terms of, well, what experts, given the type of offence you're looking at, we would recommend that you have meaningful discussions with the following experts. You don't have to pay for them or commission them, but there needs to be a conversation that takes place to ensure that you're simply not passing that particular crime type under the radar.
And do your two colleagues feel the same way, or would anybody like to make a spirited bid for going back to the public sector provision?
I think personally, I'm talking in terms of myself. My view is that something as important as this, we need to consider whether or not it should be managed by the state. But I think if we were to stay with the system that we've got, I would agree with Carl in terms of the oversights that we need. But I also think that we need to think hard about market exit. Whenever you have a marketized system, you've got to plan for the providers leaving that for whatever reason that may be. And I wonder whether there's been, in the speed that everyone's had to work within the new system, whether we've thought through some of the implications for that.
So you're sitting on the fence.
Very much so. When I'm saying I'm talking personally, I personally believe that there are certain services which are for the good of society which we need to consider running essentially in the same way that we might think about the NHS or something like that. But that's a personal preference that I have.
How about Dr. Morris?
For the most part, I agree with Carl and Tim. I would say that some more centralised assistance for digital forensics, particularly with the new ISO accreditation that's been brought in and the knock-on effect that's had in terms of different organisations interpreting it in very different ways, so that we can get a bit more standardisation in the digital forensics process would be good.
Lord Hunt and then Lord Griffiths.
So you're saying the fact that, as you gave evidence earlier on, that you've been, whatever it is, 30 or 40 times more often a witness for the prosecution and 1 or 2 times for the defence. So what you're saying is, if I understand it, generally there'll be much more scientific evidence provided for prosecution services than for defence services. And that is a current situation. And are there any statistics, for example, for the amount of forensic research available to the defence compared to the prosecution?
I'm not aware. I've never seen any. Purely my anecdotal casebook. It would be an interesting thing for the Forensic Science Society.
I think a PQ will be put down on that.
Yeah.
So currently there is no evidence for that.
Not that I'm aware of.
That is incredible.
Lord Griffiths.
But sorry, is that true in other countries as well? I don't think so.
I suspect not. I suspect in continental Europe, because you do have a magisterial system that is advising on the use of particular experts, that is less likely to be the case. I think, although one of the challenges, again, speaking on behalf of niche forensic sciences, if you look at systems such as the Netherlands, where you do still have a state-run archaeology and anthropology service within their forensic institute, the risk then is that you have a very small group of people, because how many senior reporting scientists are you going to salary? Me and Tim sat in an office waiting for these jobs to come in. So the market can also create breadth within that we see in this system.
Okay, Lord Griffiths.
Following on from this discussion, what do you think the role of the forensic science regulator should be? And do you think the powers that they have should be made statutory?
I think that the role of the regulator should be to hold forensic service providers like myself to task, that by insisting upon adherence to ISO accreditation, that will improve work across the board. My concern with that is that I'm extremely fortunate to be in a position to have a company that could afford that process. If I am the only person who can do that, then there's no benefit gained by being the last man standing there, because effectively my little ecosystem will wither on the branch, and forensic archaeology will be no more. So I think that before statutory powers are passed to the regulator, a fairly broad conversation needs to be had about what support can be put in place to ensure that that very potentially quite a bludgeon as a tool doesn't see the end of the breadth that we started this session with. You know, that we do have a tradition of forensic science that embraces all sorts of other experts. So how can we continue to work within it?
Because regulation is effectively a tax, and on a company.
It is.
And if you can't pay the tax, you're not in business.
You're not in the sector, that's correct. And it's
Do
much
you think,
easier
therefore, seeing this issue is so important, is there a case for a subsidy to be made by the Treasury to this activity?
That will be an interesting area to explore. There's certainly a world of difference in the sort of revenue that a large forensic service provider would get from a regional police contract sending biology and DNA work into them, and the cost then of ISO accreditation and the benefits that come from it, compared with those specialisms. So I think that perhaps organised through the Chartered Society or through the various accrediting professional societies, that a subsidy would be an interesting thing to explore.
Is ISO accreditation the only game in town? And is that the appropriate? And is it an appropriate? Is it perhaps a sledgehammer to crack a nut, or should there be something more tailored to for the forensic world than simply, and well, not simply, but the very broad and international type of standard that ISO delivers?
I would. It is something of a sledgehammer. So, as a forensic archaeologist, the chief ISO standard that would affect my life is 17020, which is the scene side of ISO. It's a standard that police forces across the country are currently wrestling with, trying to understand how they can, how their crime scene investigation departments can function and accredit a whole range of different services they perform on crime scenes.
Okay.
Sorry. Yes. Yeah, I have deep concerns.
But there is no other game in town than that.
No, I mean it's a confusing marketplace, and I'm the chair of the Institute for Archaeology's special interest group in forensic archaeology, and we have an expert panel in a similar way to there being a professional panel within the Royal Anthropological Institute. So as an aspirant forensic archaeologist, I can develop a case working portfolio and put it to that group, and I can become accredited, and those people who are currently experts within that group meet that accreditation criteria, but ISO is going to place another hurdle on that for most of them who sit within either commercial archaeological units or universities, it will be a hurdle that there is no means by which they can meet.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry that our time has run out, but thank you very much indeed for coming to help us today. It's been a most interesting session. If you, in reflection, think that you could have said more about some of the questions that we asked, please feel free to send in written or email to Donna your comments. That will be most welcome and will be used as the evidence. Okay? So thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Okay.
Yes, I believe in the, and in certainly in some of the reports prepared for the Home Office around transforming forensics, we looked at some other European structures around
if you can,
research.
If you can let us have that information or a reference to how we can get it. Thank you very much indeed. We'll shut the broadcast off just now for...
Proceeding is currently suspended. The 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 proceeding is currently suspended.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much indeed for coming along today to help us with this inquiry. Your role is quite important in us exploring the different issues of the use of forensic science, the science itself, and in the criminal justice system. If you don't mind introducing yourself for the record from my left, so we can get you on record, and if any of you want to make an opening statement, please feel free to do so. Otherwise, we'll move on to the questions.
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invite. I'm Mark Burns-Williamson, Police and Crime Commissioner for West Yorkshire and Chair of the National Association of Police and Crime Commissioners. The reason why I'm here principally is because I do pick up this portfolio on behalf of Police and Crime Commissioners, and obviously here today to assist the inquiry. Thank you.
Afternoon, I'm Jo Ashworth. I have been working in forensic science world for 30 years, both with the Forensic Science Service and with police forces, and now on national programmes. I'm currently the Programme Director for the Transforming Forensics Programme on behalf of the National Police Chiefs Council and the Association of Police and Crime Commissioners.
Good afternoon. My name's James Vaughan. I'm the Chief Constable of Dorset Police, and I'm also the National Lead for Forensic Science for the National Police Chiefs Council. Thank you for the invite. I have no opening statement. I hope you found my written submission of some use. I'm happy to take questions, sir.
All your written submissions are very useful. Thank you very much. If you don't have any opening statement, any of you, can I kick off with the question? And maybe this is directly addressed to you, Dr. Ashworth, because in your evidence that you sent about the Transforming Forensics Program, and the question I have about it is, you might want to say a bit more about it, but the question I have is it entirely focused, as is financed by the Police Federation, for the police, or is it also providing forensic services to others, including private sector? What is this program and who is it aimed for and what will it do?
Okay, I'll start off with explaining how it's financed. It's financed through a fund called the Police Transformation Fund, which is administered by the Home Office. The fund itself has been top-sized from policing budgets.
And the amount is 30 million, is that right?
It's 30 million over 2 years, this year and the next financial year for this programme. The aim of the fund is to assist police programmes at a national and a local level to deliver transformational change within policing. Of course, that's broader than just police forces themselves. It is the criminal justice system as a whole. And from a forensic science point of view, it's the whole network of forensic capabilities, not just those delivered within police forces. So it does extend to the private sector market and services and learning that we can gain from academia and industry.
Okay. And who's in control of the budget? I mean, you say it's financed by the Home Office, but is it government department who oversees it, or is it?
Let me take it. Yeah. The department that actually administers it is the Law Enforcement Transformation Unit, but they do that on behalf of a joint body, which is the Police Reform and Transformation Board. Colleagues are probably more experienced in answering to that particular question than I am. I think, Mark, you're a member of that board.
Yeah, so this is a joint board that consists of Chief Constables, Police and Crime Commissioners, the Home Office, and that fund basically is earmarked or top sliced, as Joe has said, from the overall policing budget into what's called transformation projects. But ultimately it is the Home Office that decide on the amount of money that goes into there.
Okay, Lord Fox.
Could you give me an example of what a transformation project is, what it looks like, and what averagely it would cost? So we get a sense of what this programme is.
Would you like me to explain transforming forensics in a slightly broader sense?
Yeah, because it doesn't make much sense to me at the moment. So, yeah.
I think, if I may, that it's most helpful if we maybe set the scene in terms of why we created the programme in the first place. It's a response to risks and issues in the policing forensic world, which I think James will answer.
I wonder, Chair, if I can help with that. In 2016, the Home Office published the forensic forensic science strategy. And within that, it describes a number of risks and challenges in forensics. And it sets out a vision of how we should respond to some of those risks. To translate that vision and that strategy into action and outcomes, what we've done is pull together a programme of work. It's called the Transforming Forensics Programme, a cheesy title perhaps, but it's a very serious programme of work that seeks to address the issues that were laid out in the strategy in 2016, including things like accreditation, problems with research and development, national coordination of forensic science within policing and criminal justice, and some of the issues that we see presented in the marketplace. So that was where the programme had its origins. Joe is the programme director and can take you through, hopefully at a high level, some of the key deliverables and some of the key things the programme's seeking to achieve for us.
So, in response to the strategy, and I was appointed as programme director at the end of the 2016-17 period, and we did a lot of consultation with police forces, partners, academia and others to look at what a programme of work might look like. One of the biggest issues within forensic services is the way that we're organised. A lot of forensic work is done within police forces, 43 different legal entities with 86 corporations so it doesn't go to an easy task. We very quickly recognised that the way to deliver some benefit and transformation into this world was to start working together as a network of capability. So again, not just within police forces, extending to private sector and academic partners so that we can deliver things, again, quite cheesily, once for the benefit of many rather than everybody struggling to do things separately and duplicating effort and cost and possibly doing a lot of nugatory work. So the central tenet of our programme is a concept that we call the Forensic Capability Network, which is working across the whole of those forensic capabilities, knitted together with a central structure, a central team and technological infrastructure that allow us to work together more effectively, integrating capabilities and dealing directly as a single voice on behalf of the forensic service and the forensic network around relationship with the market, relationship with research and development, looking at quality accreditation and how that can be achieved more efficiently, as well as delivering it to the appropriate standard, and also some work around actually how we can build in resilience not only with the techniques, processes and capacity, but in the skills and competency of our people. So that's a very high level strategic view of what the Forensic Capability Network idea is about, but we have started to build that capacity in the middle, starting with a forensic market engagement and industry team, which is to do that very element of liaison with the private sector market, not just in the existing established one, but the broader market, which is much less established and relied on around digital forensics.
Can I just ask, at that very high level, that was very interesting, but if I went to a local police force and there was a particular crime and so on, and I said to the officers there, what do you expect from what you are doing? What do you think they'd say?
I think the local officer, by and large, would be quite blind to what we're doing, and in many ways that is not such a bad thing, because we're trying to build resilience in so that locally they can still see a forensic service on the front line. So it's about building in capability. What they would say is whatever the central team is doing, I want them to make sure that I have the appropriate forensic response where I need it and when I need it. At the local level, but also delivering something maybe once for the benefit of many that they don't need to have at their fingertips on the front line. And a good example would be crime scene investigators are a frontline in response. We talked about CSI in the previous session. They're a frontline response, so they need to be in the community, working at crime scenes. But anything that relies on a digital product doesn't need to be on your doorstep. So it could be digital forensic science, it could be biometrics like fingerprints, which could be done in a much more efficient way in an integrated, more centralised structure.
Mr. Young.
You talked about the large number of police forces and the disparate structure of the arrangements across England and Wales. Do forces generally evaluate their forensic support, and if so, what does that reveal?
I'll tap that one for you. We do, but the way that forensic outcomes have been evaluated over recent years has been, frankly, quite binary. We've been collecting data that supports a previous regime of top-down performance management, where outcomes around volume crime seemed more important than they do now. There is a change of culture in policing where we look at outcomes around safeguarding, we look at outcomes around safety more than sanction detection rates, and that led to a drive in forensic science for us to measure the things that fitted in with that regime. So when we go to measure and evaluate the value of forensic science, often we find data that's unhelpful in understanding the true value of forensic science. It's very difficult to measure the value of one fingerprint that stops a recidivist from committing a whole spate of domestic burglary. It's very difficult to measure the value of one homicide case or one terror case which has been solved or resolved through the use of forensic science. So what we've done with transforming forensics is we've undertaken a couple of studies. We've used the Open University. We've done a private piece of study to try and find new ways of evaluating the value of forensic science going forward. And we have some good ideas and some good methods going forward, that we collect data sensibly across the country, that we collect the data that matters, so that we can present a better picture of the true value of forensics, to get away from this past fixation with binary numbers and outcomes.
So will that mean that once your programme's completed, you'll be able to do a compare and contrast with different forces across the country to see where attention needs to be given?
That's the hope and that's the ambition. I mean, Joe, I don't know whether you wanted to add anything more to the specific recommendations from the research.
I think what the research did was it showed the value of forensic services to different sort of actors across the criminal justice system, but from their point of view only. And it was interesting that their point of view was quite different depending on where they were in the ecosystem of the criminal justice system, which you'd probably expect. So someone from the judiciary wants to see robust forensic science presented in courts in a way that is understandable, whereas an investigator wants to be able to resolve leads in an investigation and identify whether a crime has been committed and who the perpetrator is and who the innocents are, etc. So it wasn't surprising. But what it also said was that we do not even attempt to collect information and value information through those different lenses. We do what's easy, which is we do the counting, which has got very limited value. So in the programme, we want to put in systems, particularly where national systems are already being developed, where the appropriate questions are asked at the right point in the criminal justice process as to whether the forensic product added value, with a huge caveat that the product itself will not be necessarily a binary issue, because who can get into the mind of a member of the jury when a case is presented to them? So we have to be realistic about what the art of the possible is. I think the second part of the answer to that question is that we want to make sure that where policing very effectively apply sort of vulnerability assessments to response in crimes at the front end, that we apply similar criteria through the forensic response, which has traditionally not been the case. And what I mean by that is that often the amount of work that enters a forensic supply chain will eventually make its way to the end, regardless of whether it needs to be done and valuable to that case. And we want to put more measures in place to make that a much more proportionate and measured response in the appropriate crime itself.
Is there a sort of handy version of the programme describing your transforming forensics programme with sort of work streams and timetables and outcomes that we could have a look at?
I can certainly send you something. You might regret what you wish for. Yes.
I love it. I love it. Thank you, Tim.
If it's that big, just send to Baroness Young, and we'll get a briefing from her. Baroness Young, Baroness Young, have you got any? No. Okay, Lord Hunt.
What? Talk about the outcomes of the review. Do you know when it's going to be published, and are changes needed to ensure forensic science provision is maintained at the level required? And what are the risks of a market approach? And if I may add my own point, you're here to answer it. What about the services provided to the defence and the prosecution, and the extreme inequality as we understand it? Perhaps you have a different view on that.
Yeah, perhaps I could start on that. So obviously we've taken part in that review sponsored by the Home Office. It has yet to be published, and that's still with ministers. Short answer is yes, there does need to be changes.
How long has it been with the ministers?
There does need to be changes.
I can help. Not too long, sir. The review was done over the summer. The final drafts were given to were given to senior officials in September, I believe. The minister, they're with the minister now, and I'm not able to say when the minister plans to publish, but the near future is my understanding.
Okay. Sorry, please carry.
Yeah. So in the previous session, we've heard about some of the fragmentation, obviously post the abolition of the Forensic Science Service, and some of the market failures have, clearly caused a lot of concern and confidence within the market. So we've got the ongoing Randox investigation into those cases.
Sorry, what is that, Randox?
It's a company, a major forensics company.
Just to be accurate, was it Randox or was it a company previously that Randox took over?
Yeah, I mean, basically, it's an ongoing investigation into a couple of employees that have been accused of manipulating some of the samples. So, but suffice to say that has sort of really impacted a significant part of the market. Then we've had more recently a company called Key Forensics who went into administration, and again, colleagues, James, some of my colleagues, had to move very quickly to rescue that situation. To be fair, the Met and MOPAC acted very quickly there as well to protect the integrity of around about 2,000 cases. But there's clearly an ongoing fragility around the marketplace.
Okay. I'm going to kind of jump in because that's exactly where I was going to come in. And coming from my manufacturing background, I would call this the supply chain. Okay, and you've got tier 1 suppliers, which are the big labs, and then you've got tier 2, tier 3, which are smaller. And my guess is that you've got a big bunch of your market is perhaps covered by a small number of bigger companies, and then you've got a very, very long tail. And managing, I'm assuming that your role, part of your role, is to manage that supply chain. Mm-hmm. Part of that is accreditation, and we'll come to that in a minute, and the other part is the stability to which Mark has just alluded. So what levers do you have available to you in terms of strategically making sure you've got sufficient capacity in the supply chain to deliver what the overall 43 services require? And secondly, what are you doing around accreditation? Because accrediting the 2 or 3 or 4 big labs is one thing, but accrediting the long tail, as we've just heard from the previous evidence, is almost impossible. And what are the implications of having a service that is only partially accredited?
So I'll try to answer those. Can I perhaps just give a high-level overview of market risk, picking up on Lord Hunt's question? The question was, what are the risks of a market approach? I don't think it's the market approach, but there are risks in the market. I don't think it's
I've kind of diverged from that question. It's more about the stability of your supply chain. So for lots of reasons. Some of it is of your making because you're driving the prices down. Yeah. Some is it of its own making because it was the way it's financed or whatever.
You're allowed to answer my question.
Yes, of course.
The forensic marketplace accounts for about 20% of service provision for law enforcement in forensic services. 80% of our forensic science is actually CSIs and fingerprint experts and people that we employ in-house. The marketplace tends to provide services like DNA and some other specialist science, as you heard from colleagues in the room today. Overall, that market is a niche market in its own right. Yeah. It started in 2012. I think we were spending about 120 million in that market. That market today, by the market's own assessment, is about 55 million. We think we spend a bit more than that, but the market is halved in size. So it was a niche market that's halved in size. And policing have been quite ferocious with their procurement activity to drive a really hard bargain into it. We weren't very good at that years ago. 8 years of austerity has driven those kind of disciplines into people like me and people like Mark very, very well. So,
can Lord Valence just interject?
Would it be fair to say that the problem, the squeeze on the market that you've been talking about, would have also occurred had it not been a market, but had it been part of the public sector? In other words, the squeeze is to do with the reduction in resources available rather than demand. Is that fair?
Partially true. Certainly there are less resources to go round, so police procurement practice has become keener and keener. I need to be fair to the forensic service providers that we've worked in partnership with now for a number of years, who've enabled policing to drive out cost in partnership. So we're spending half the amount of money. Performance is better, so we are seeing quicker turnaround times, and quality is better because all of the large forensic companies are fully accredited. Unlike, I'm sad to say, all of policing in some of our disciplines. So part of it would have, if forensic science had remained in public ownership, austerity would have meant changes and savings would have had to be made. I'm sure somebody would have taken over and driven efficiencies in. I think the market's actually been a good vehicle to drive those efficiencies out. How do I, as the national lead for forensics, ensure that the supply chain remains sustainable? And this is an area of business that cannot be allowed to fail. We are, obvious point I know, but we are so heavily reliant upon forensic science to bring criminal justice outcomes from every level right up to terrorism that it cannot be allowed to fail. And the 43 chief constables across the country need access to those services. There are 3 large suppliers, one very large, one medium-sized, and one just about gets into the top 3, and then a whole chain of very small suppliers. You've met one of those suppliers this morning, almost a one-man band. The way policing procure services varies, and part of our work with transforming forensics is to bring better consistency to procurement practice. But what's evolved over the last 6 or 7 years are broadly two models of procurement. One is a partnership managed service model where a large provider, and really only the large providers can operate in that space, work very, very closely with a police force or a police region. In some cases, those regions are 20 police forces. And they work in a managed service way, and most people understand what a managed service is. And then the other model that's evolved is a commoditised market, where unit cost is the king. There are penalties, there are quick turnaround times. It feels very competitive, and if you were dealing in anything other than forensics, it was exactly the market model you would advocate. I think in forensics, the reality, I think the history will show us that commoditised model has forced the suppliers to a point where they're competing so heavily on price, and the contracts are so big and they come around so infrequently that when they do bid for work, there is a fear they'll lose the market share and bring their prices right down to, in my view, an unsustainable level. It's not for me to provide analysis here on why key forensics went into administration, but I'm sure that was a factor. Certainly what I'm told from other parts of the industry. So that's a real problem for us. What will most likely happen over the coming months and years is there will undoubtedly be a pricing restructure. The market is not sustainable with the current pricing structures we have it. And all forensic providers are telling me that privately and publicly. If you bring them before the panel, I'm sure they will share their views with you in the committee. But there is a pricing structural problem that we need to fix quickly. And second to that,
Lord Fox, that goes into your question. But would you like to?
Well, I was waiting for the next bit, but the. What is the process of that restructuring? I mean, do they just come back and say, we're going to put our prices up? I mean, they can't form a cartel to do that. So how do you help them? Because it's not in your interest for them to price themselves out of the market.
So one of the urgent things that we're doing in response to the Home Office Commission review, was I'm not at liberty to talk about the detail now, I am at liberty to talk about the work that we've got on with. It couldn't wait for the Minister's final sign-off with ministerial sort of permission. We've got on and we've built new capability within policing which is the Forensic Market Engagement and Industry and Engagement Team. It's got a great title, but they are there to do market intelligence, market engagement, to ensure that policing, which is 43 different police forces, often collaborated on forensics actually, to give a single voice to the market, to give the market better in understanding of future capability needs, market attitude, and direction of travel. And that team is there are 3 people already in the team. The manager of the team's under recruitment. That team will help us work very closely with the market to negotiate how pricing restructure should take place, and that could be one of 2 things. It could be we allow contracts to run their course and re-tender. I suspect that we'll be having a conversation and some negotiations outside of that.
Okay, Lord Fox, do you want to move on to some other points?
Well, no. I mean, I think we talked a bit about accreditation, and your view was that the key big ones are accredited. How do you get the smaller companies accredited? And you also, I think, intimated that internally in the police forces there is a problem around accreditation. So perhaps one of you could pick up on that as well.
So on the key disciplines, such as DNA analysis and some of the high volume processes, actually you can't enter the market or you won't win a contract unless you have those standards. So it's a prerequisite for
it was the niche stuff which seemed to be the issue around accreditation.
And what some of the niche providers would say is that there are some disproportionate costs to achieve accreditation. It's very expensive to get accreditation, which is probably why some chief constables haven't got their finger out quickly enough. But there is, so the smaller providers absolutely find they struggle to justify the cost with no guarantee of work being given to them, because the contracts often are won by the larger companies. So what's the solution there?
Is do you allow them to not be accredited, or do you bully them into becoming accredited, or just do without them?
No, I think that comes back to the procurement discussion that we have with providers. It is a two-way street with providers. If there's going to be a need for pricing restructure, which I'm told by providers there is, and I accept that, there may well be an opportunity for me to negotiate terms where subcontracting arrangements can be looked upon differently to help the smaller providers. We do need...
So they come through the proverbial tier one rather than directly to you.
We do need the Professor Harrisons of the world, even though he might only do 50 cases a year. It's very difficult for companies to be viable when they're used so infrequently. But forensic science in policing and criminal justice require them. So there has to be a better relationship with niche providers and the largers.
Didn't answer my question about whether you're dealing with the defence as well. All what you're talking about is the prosecution, isn't that right?
My understanding is that the defence are fishing in the same pool. We don't have a defence companies. We do have a range of individual often academics that will be a defence expert in one particular very, very niche field. But generally speaking, the defence access the same pool of scientists that we do. So take fingerprints, for instance. There are a few ex-fingerprint experts that are on the circuit provided defence evidence.
Because you're concentrating on the police forensics, presumably we will get that evidence about the defence side when we have evidence from the private sector. Because they are the same people providing evidence to you and them. Is that right?
To the prosecution and the defence.
Maybe I can just help a little bit, but I think you probably will need to ask them directly. I think one of the things that we need to bear in mind, and it wasn't mentioned in the previous evidence, is that through the criminal procedure rules, we do have rules around the way that cases are managed and evidence is managed through expert witnesses, where there are procedures now where expert witnesses are required to discuss and agree evidence prior to the court process. And so it's only the issues that are presented to the court rather than the evidence that's agreed. Right. And whilst I can't give you any statistics, I won't say that there is necessarily a level playing field for sole defence providers. What you probably will find is that the evidence is agreed, and so that you don't necessarily see the adversarial defence scientist versus the prosecution scientist. And the expert witness process is very well laid out in the criminal procedure.
Thank you for that. That clarifies.
Close on the in-house part. You mentioned some chief constables have been slow on this. How slow? Will they make the deadline, or are we going to find that there are going to be big lumps of the police force who haven't been accredited within their own forensic services?
So, sadly, no, not all police forces or police regions will meet the accreditation standards in the full range of disciplines within the timeframe set by the forensic regulator. I'm not here to make excuses on behalf of my colleagues, but I will provide perhaps some explanation as to why we haven't fully accredited the police service. The first thing to say is that we are underinvested in accreditation expertise in policing in England and Wales, and in addition to that, we've tried poorly, and this is something else that will be addressed by transforming forensics. We've tried to do it 43 different ways, and when you have small capability and you try and do it on a disparate level, you make slow progress. And when you're underinvested and then you make slow progress and you do it in a disparate way, then the possibility of reaching those deadlines was bad. There is, and I've reassured the regulator on numerous occasions more recently. I've taken over this portfolio within the last 6 months. We have a dedicated deputy chief constable who leads on standards for me, who runs a police quality and standards group, where the regulator sits on that group, and he drives the activity and tries to influence police and crime commissioners and chief constables to work harder towards accreditation. That work's accelerated very much so over the last 6 to 12 months. In fact, we've stepped up and now, sorry to use police jargon, but we're using a gold steering group. It's now got to a point where we're saying it's so important and the deadlines are coming and going without accreditation being met, that it needs strategic leadership at a national level to drive the activity. And there is strong ministerial direction. I had a conversation with the Minister only yesterday with Mark Burns-Williamson around this issue. So there is
okay. I'm going to move on now because of time problem. Lord Kicker.
Just to turn to the question of the role of the forensic science regulator, what should it be? Should it have statutory powers, and if so, what should those be? And in terms of the failure to achieve accreditation, does that raise concerns in terms of potentially a regulator with regard to the safety of criminal prosecutions based upon forensic services that are not accredited?
Deal with that one as well. So that the risks of being, and we are working at risk in some areas already. It's probably fair to say that a good deal of forensic services provided by police are fully accredited, DNA, fingerprint enhancement, and etc. And there is a number of new areas of accreditation that we're expected to reach. Fingerprint comparisons was October. We've not reached that across the board. We have CSIs coming online, fire investigation, collision investigation, and all of that is now working at pace. The risk of not being accredited is already manifest in that now if you obtain digital evidence, if you obtain evidence from a non-accredited scientific source, then you have to make those disclosures to a court head, and that they give the defence community and the trial judge the opportunity to assess whether or not that impacts upon the admissibility of the evidence. So that will continue. Section 78 of the Police and Criminal Evidence Act is about unfairly obtained evidence. Trial judges will need to assess in the future where evidence has been obtained in an unaccredited lab, whether or not that should be admitted. That's one risk. Another risk is one of judicial review. I think that's a lively risk that we would face. And of course there are risks of quality failings and miscarriages of justice as well, which is why the standards have been brought in and why the bar continues to be raised and appropriately.
And what is the role of the regulator in all of this and statutory powers?
The regulator, as a previous witness said, she's here, and I work very closely with Dr. Tully, and she's here to hold me and my colleagues and forensic providers to account for meeting standards, and she does that very robustly. I think it is the government's full intention to give her statutory powers. Those statutory powers would enable her to take enforcement action against chief constables or private providers that have been slow or failed to reach accreditation, and that is broadly welcome in the policing community.
And what is the time? Sorry, the timescale for that?
I don't know the timescales of. I know that there's a strong commitment from government. A private member's bill has failed recently. And legislation is moving forward. So I'm sorry, I don't know the actual timescales. But I know. Yes, I do.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Have you got?
No, thank you.
Any others? No. I think I'm now on to yes, Lord Valence, I think.
Yes, can we concentrate on digital forensics just for a moment? It seems to be the growth area for the future. Partly, presumably, because of the increase in cybercrime, but also because there will be more and more evidence in digital form in other types of crime. I was just wondering what's being done to make sure the police forces have the right skills in place to handle all this. And is the training part of the Transforming Forensic program?
Do you want to do it?
Yep. Within the programme, we have a specific project around digital forensic science. I stress the word science because that helps us to define the scope of the work that we're doing without us straying into the areas of investigation and intelligence analysis. That's where the risk is if individuals step outside of their boundaries of expertise. So the programme itself recognises that digital's a huge beast. It's something that's not going to be easy to address, and it's not something that we can bite in one piece. So we're building a business case, but looking to the future of how we build a technology roadmap, understanding the digital technology landscape, understanding the changing crime and the response to that from a digital forensic science point of view. And then the specific answer to your question then is understanding the competencies and skills that are required in response to that. What I will say is that clearly isn't an easy thing to find a solution for, not least because I think it was mentioned earlier, you're probably more likely to get a receptive trainee straight out of university than you are from the police and family in general. And so we do need to think completely differently about how we get those skills and nurture them. My personal view, and it's one that I'm trying to inject through the programme, is that we need to have far more partnership with industry and academia, but industry in capital letters in my view, because that is where our skills end up when we train them, and that's possibly where we can get more in terms of impact in the world that we live in. They would benefit from law enforcement experience, whilst we would benefit from their ability to go, I suppose, a leap further ahead with extra investment and oversight, particularly in the financial sector. That's a personal view, and it's something that we aspire to, and we're building a business case on how we will build digital forensics for the future. So
you're throwing up a lot of questions. Let Lord Wallace finish, and then I'll go.
I was going to ask you really a specific question on this. That cybercrime, almost by definition, is independent of geography. Okay? Whereas police forces are obviously geographically based. Does this cause you a problem? And if so, how does one solve it?
Please be brief, because
I will be brief.
questions still to go on.
Yes, it does cause us a problem. We've overcome it by ensuring that we've got some protocols in place that the police force where the victim resides, or the police force that picks up the crime, whether it was perpetrated in Iceland, Russia or Newcastle. So we've worked our way around that. As you say, cybercrime doesn't respect boundaries. It has to be anchored. The investigation has to be anchored somewhere, and that's where the victim lives. That's how we get around that.
Baroness Morgan and Lord Fox.
Could you just, and this is my lack of understanding, can you help us understand the difference or the boundaries between digital forensic sciences and digital analysis that presumably is embedded in police forces, in teams in police forces? Where exactly is the boundary in that?
It's a really difficult one to answer
Right.
in black and white terms.
Yeah.
You'd probably expect me to say it depends. But we're trying to... I'm running a programme, so being specific about deliverables and direction of travel is really important. So we're trying to define our scope through the application of the forensic standards, the quality standards. So where a forensic process in that digital supply chain requires accreditation, then that would be in the scope of our programme. It's a huge trajectory ahead in terms of progress, and so data mining, as in recovering data from devices, how we then present that back to the investigator would be a forensic process, but analysis of that process and the inquisitive nature of the questions that are asked of it at the beginning of an investigation are outside of the boundaries.
Okay, that makes sense, thank you.
Lord Fox.
Dr. Morris was very clear that they're being asked the wrong questions in terms of digital forensics. And the other evidence we heard, I think you were sat in the room, was that in the old days there used to be a forensic expert sitting inside the investigation, in a sense advising what questions to be asked. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's where you go back to, but how do you reproduce the educated purchaser that you need to be buying the right help at the right time?
I'm not sure we've gone as far backwards as some of the previous witnesses were mentioning, because some of the contracts we have with the major suppliers in particular does give us access to scientists on the ground. And in fact, in some areas in Mr. Burns-Williams' force area, scientists are actually cohabiting in the same building as police officers. So, and we do have access to specialists that will come out and advise senior investigators at crime scenes on the ground. So we might have called, I think we call them something different. It's done through a different procurement model, but essentially we still have that same access.
And in the digital world, in addition to that, there is a role, a capability that's recognised in policing called digital media investigators, which are in effect that Byford scientist for the digital world. They're often civilian staff within police forces.
Yeah, but what I would say there is that there's just a huge capacity issue with the volumes, you know, the number of, you know, mobile phones, tablets, desktops. There's a real cultural shift needed in terms of the investigative skills that are required within the service.
So this business case that you're developing, Dr. Ashford, who is it addressed to? Who is it for?
Again, that's an interesting question. We are putting some structures in on the ground to help with the here and now, but the business case is really what we're trying to build. If I was to lay that in front of a body today, it would Police Transformation Fund and the PRTB process, which we discussed earlier. Our understanding is that will end in March 2020, which is when our current funding runs out. So that question is to be answered in the meantime in terms of how we look at police transformation going forward.
So if I gather from the comments that we heard and what you just say, it suggests to me, one, that we as a country are weak just now in terms of digital forensics because we don't have a proper strategy about how to develop digital forensics and how to use digital forensics. And that it is not driven centrally by the government departments at all. And you developing a business case quite independently that you hope will become part of the transformation program or set aside on its own. We heard on the earlier session about academia and how many academic departments are currently involved, and it sounds, from what we heard from Dr. Norris, was not many. So there seems to be a big gap in any strategy related to digital forensics, and yet it's a growing problem. Am I paraphrasing this right?
Personally, I would agree with most of that. I think we're not developing a business case independently. It's supported by broader policing and it's supported by funding from the current PTF fund. It's not to say that there will not be alternative arrangements for funding transformation post the current arrangements, but that's, I mean, Mark will understand this better than I do, that's a yearly cycle.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we operate within Treasury spending rules like everybody else, but you will know sometimes that's very unhelpful because you have to plan.
So if we were going to make a recommendation about this, who would we address that recommendation to?
Well, there is some ongoing work in the wider comprehensive spending review for policing, but clearly this goes well beyond policing. It goes into the criminal justice world, and there needs to be a considered recommendation from the review that we spoke about earlier that we can't really go into too much detail today around making sure that's an integrated submission around this wider research and development piece that we need to bring in into this work as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Lord Borwick.
The needs of the police from forensic science when you're investigating crimes could be different than the needs of the criminal justice system when they're prosecuting it. Is that actually a difference in needs, and how do you reconcile those two needs?
I'm not sure that is a problem. The criminal justice partners, so particularly the crime prosecution service, more often these days the trial judge and the police, when somebody's been charged with an offence, the case management tends to be joined up between the two. So so forensic work that's required as part of the prosecution is done in a collegiate way. So it's not led just by the police. The prosecutor may ask for further work to be done. Indeed, the judge can sometimes give direction, certainly on timings of work being done. So I don't think there are I don't see competing needs within the criminal justice system for forensic services.
So it may be a difference of emphasis rather than difference of
There's
processes.
often a difference in emphasis on what the budget holder thinks is necessary and what the prosecutor may want to be done. They may want 50 tests done and the police budget holder might say, well, actually, let's do the first 25 and see where we get. So there might be a different emphasis there, and that's more to do with who holds the budget and who's accountable for that. But broadly, we are trying to achieve the same thing, which is a sort of search for the truth, rather than old-fashioned mindsets of case building
Yes.
by the police.
And if I may, as Lord Fox pointed out, the supply chain that is forensic science, the needs are different depending on where you are in the supply chain. So I think that it changes over the lifetime, and that's why it's really important to have a more partnership approach, not only with the criminal justice system, but with our forensic private sector partners. But we do welcome even closer working relationships with them, I would suggest.
Dr. Hunt.
Just to go back to the point of our chairman about the UK's forensic science and digital and artificial intelligence, all of that. I mean, the question was asked whether you have some connection with the new computer centre in London. I mean, is that because there isn't? I mean, in a way, all this has happened since the original forensic centre was privatised. But it is a great national facility now that we have of the Turing Centre, and I just really wonder whether that is something you're looking into, or is there some equivalent initiative? Because it's a very, very important possibility. And as I was saying, it's not just the crime; it's the business of modelling and matching the whole of the society. It's a rather fascinating development, and I think if you should be, the government is a funny way. It suddenly spends money. I mean, suddenly spending money in the Turing Institute. And I just wonder whether this might be a good place to get some money for yourselves.
It would be great to knock on the door and get it. I think that's the first thing to say. But I suspect that the broader cybercrime portfolio within the NPCC has a closer connection with that centre than the digital forensic science element that we look at. Having said that, and I don't think I quite finished answering your question, there's some excellent pockets of activity around the country around digital forensic science, both at the sort of mass processing level and at the higher end of more complex examinations, the National Crime Agency, the Metropolitan Police, other forces. So part of the purpose of my programme is to sweep up that good practice and see if we can share it through the single forensic capability network concept.
Okay.
So just on that, it seems that this seems to be more of domain for the service than universities, therefore, because we heard, as the chairman said, a very short list of universities that seem to be active in it. So what you've just described is essentially public sector organisations seem to be picking up the mantle on that. Would that be the case?
They do currently, but we do recognise that there is a private sector requirement here. And we do tend to use private sector suppliers, but on an ad hoc basis when the capacity within the police services is not sufficient. But it's not the best relationship, and it doesn't manage their ability to plan for
so
capacity.
The bulk is kind of in-house? Or,
yeah.
Yes.
If I may, Chair, one of the problems with digital, it's growing so quickly, then the piece that we're looking at, which is digital forensics, trying to signal to the marketplace and the users in policing which is the best direction of travel. Should we build further in-house capability, or should we actually signal to the market that we're going to rely on the market in the long term, are things that we need to set out in a clearer strategy, because at the moment neither are investing sufficiently. And in my private view is I think this is a place for the market to grow and policing to retract, because the market have proven very capable of delivering good services in traditional forensics, and I'm sure they will step up on this as well.
A quick question from Lord Valence and then move on to Lord Mayor.
You seem to be suggesting to me that the issue here is as much a shortage of existing forensic skills and resources in the right places rather than a shortage of funding of research in forensic science. Is that right? What's
I think it's a combination of both.
Both.
To be quite honest, yeah.
Both.
Right, yeah.
Okay, Lord Mayor.
Thank you, Chairman. I think my question really is following on from what we've already been discussing. In your evidence, National Police Chiefs Council written evidence, you talked about the Forensic Capability Network having an R&D role specifically to develop a long-term capability. A long-term capability and technology roadmap was the phrase that you used. And that involves, as I understand it, partnerships with academia and industry. Can you say a bit more about that? What kind of partnerships do you envisage? I mean, you talked a little bit about universities, but by industry, do you mean the private sector?
Yes.
And by that, you mean private sector forensic companies, or do you mean, what do you mean by industry?
The whole breadth, because I think as the previous individual said, that there's a whole broad range of forensic science, and particularly in the academic area, forensic science as a particular discipline is not recognised. It's the application of science that comes through biology, engineering and computer science and all sorts of other things. So they're the sort of relationships that we need to nurture. Our view is that there are pockets of activity going on in policing and out of policing. However, it's in isolation, it's not shared, it's not coordinated. I suggest there's probably still not sufficient investment in those areas, but there is some investment, we're just not capitalising on it. So the Forensic Capability Network idea is to start coordinating that and be the single voice, signal to the market where our requirements are. We don't even have a single set of policing and law enforcement, criminal justice requirements of the market, be it research and development, innovation or other services, and that's the first place to start. And the final part of that is we want to introduce into our Forensic Capability Network the role of the chief scientist, which could be a tenured role, so we want someone quite eminent who has ability to make sure that science is at the fundamental basis of everything that we do.
And to what extent do you envisage blue sky research being part of this long-term roadmap?
Well, in the roadmap, there'll be a complete spectrum from blue sky research all the way into market ready, and there's a recognised roadmap between those two in terms of readiness as you go through blue sky research through to actual implementation and all sorts of other areas, and we will concentrate on each step. It's difficult to manage blue sky research because it comes out of left field. So it's more about understanding what's happening rather than managing that end of the spectrum.
And do you think it's going to be more difficult to get funding for that end of the spectrum, the blue sky research?
I don't think it's going to be easy, so I think the answer to your question is yes. Having said that, I think we need to be more innovative in how we attract funding. The Home Office have set up a body called the Science and the Justice Forum, which is a collection of individuals from judiciary and all sorts of other actors across the criminal justice system and academia. And I think the aspiration is to use that as a forum, as a clearing house for some ideas and possibly to attract funding. It remains to be seen whether that will be successful.
Okay, thank you.
Lord Fox has 10-second question.
Very quickly, a lot of the blue sky bit is in fact people will be developing new measurements, new ways of doing things without necessarily thinking of the forensic world. So how do you communicate to that world of if you like, process development and measurement development, the needs of the forensic industry, so all the forensic is part of your life?
It's a really good point, because as many people will know, DNA technology was invented in medicine and not. The Science and Justice Forum is a good step. It's in that direction. Getting the membership of that board that goes across disciplines and across sectors, I think, is going to be the key to ensuring that we capitalise on good research in other sectors that probably weren't thinking about forensic science when they were developing that particular piece of research. That's a really good point.
Okay. If I were to ask you that if we wanted to recommend one recommendation that will bring about coordination of good forensic science, good use of that evidence in criminal justice system, and that the strategy to do that will have to be, what will that recommendation be?
Goodness. I think the regulation and the move towards statutory provision for the forensic regulator is a really good place to start, because forensic science has been rocked by a number of issues, and public confidence in forensic science must be at the forefront of what we do. I think that's a really good place to start, and I know that there is a commitment to bring that forward. That would be my guess. What's your wish?
Dr. Ashford?
You might not be surprised to hear that my wish would be that the concept of the Forensic Capability Network becomes a recognised brand that can become the voice of the service, and not just for policing but across the whole criminal justice system for forensic science. I think a lot of the solutions lie in that single voice and the communication to industry, academia and others.
Yeah, and you know, for me it needs a bit more direction from government on some of these things, because...
what kind of direction?
Well, clearly we've talked about the fragmentation, you know, the some of the strategic issues within the market, and, you know, in order to make some of this happen, you know, clearer directions from government around investing in this capabilities network, around accreditation, yes, in terms of statutory responsibilities for the regulator as well. You know, there's a package there that needs to be driven through.
Okay. Well, thank you all very much indeed. It's been